Hey guys, today I'm actually going to be talking about something that's relatively new to my life. I've always ridden, but I've never had the opportunity to do anything off-road or cross-country until I moved up here to Marquette. After my first ride, I absolutely fell in love with it, so I'm going to be talking about the physiology of mountain biking today. I'm going to give you a little bit of background on mountain biking, body measurements of the bikers, intensity of the ride, physiological characteristics of the athlete, and application of all this information. The purpose is to describe physiological characteristics of mountain biking and provide training advice based on this analysis. So historically, bikes were intended for paved roads. They were modified for off-road trails. In 1970, mountain biking started becoming popular. In 1990, the first World Championship was organized by the International Cyclists Union, the UCI. Mountain biking became an Olympic sport in 1996. What I think is really cool about this is that the very first mountain bike competition for the Olympics was actually held in the Georgia International Horse Park in Atlanta here in the United States. And according to Levesque, from 2006 to 2012, about 17% of Americans were partaking in some form of mountain biking. It's a multidisciplinary sport. So downhill, you take a lift up to the top of a mountain and you use gravity to help you get down the mountain. You're going over rocks and roots and in between small tight spaces and whatnot. Some ski hills actually transform into mountain bike hills on their off season. For cross-country and mixed terrain, which is the kind of biking that I like to do, it consists of up and down hills, going over roots and rocks off of jumps. It consists of single track, rough forest roads, and paved roads. Free rides, it's kind of a little bit different. It's usually done on paved surfaces. It's where the rider tries to do as many jumps or tricks in a set amount of time. And for trials, the rider attempts to finish a course without putting their foot down, which I have not yet been able to do. So according to the UCI, an off-road circuit should consist of forest roads, tracks, and earth or gravel paths. The trail should involve climbs and descents, typically around 6 to 9 kilometers, and an average altitude of about 1,500 meters. So you can see right here, this is an example of a course profile for an Olympic cross-country circuit race. And you can see the altitude changes throughout the race. So there's many different bikes to choose from. When it comes to suspension, there's a hardtail bike, which has front suspension only. A full suspension has front and back, and a rigid bike doesn't have any suspension. For speed, there's multi-geared and single speed. Generally, multi-geared is 27 speeds, and a single speed is just the one. Multi-gear is good if you're riding on a flat surface and you go down to a lower gear, you increase pedal cadence, but you decrease workload. So this is really good for when you're doing climbs. You can pedal fast without expending a lot of energy because you have gravity opposing you, pulling you back down. So getting up to the top of that hill is a little bit more difficult, which is why you want to be at a lower speed or lower gear. A lot of people choose a single speed because it increases the difficulty of the ride. Brakes. There's a bunch of different types of brakes. I'm just going to touch on the two main types. So disc brakes and rim brakes. Rim brakes actually use friction pads on the rim of your tire. You pull the trigger and it puts pressure on the tire, making it come to a stop. For disc brakes, they're connected to the hub of the tire. They have a faster stopping speed, which can get you into a little bit of trouble if you're not used to an efficient stop. Tire size, there's 26s, they're 26 inches in diameter, and these are really good for maneuvering through tight obstacles. 29ers, they're the biggest. They're really good for rolling over rocks and roots and whatnot. And then 650Bs, which are 27.5 inches, they're middle of the road, so they're better at maneuvering through things than 29ers, but they're better at rolling over than 26ers. The frame size is completely dependent on the rider. It's really important that you actually go to a bike shop and get measured for a bike if you want to start doing any type of intense riding. And it differs from brand to brand. So I know Trek does theirs in inches, and Specialized does theirs in small, medium, large, extra large. The frame type, there's aluminum, steel, and carbon. Carbon is the lightest, but it's also the most expensive. Aluminum is the middle of the road, which are what most bikes are made out of, and steel is really heavy. I'll get to why frame type is important in a little bit. So these are the different types of bikes. This is a rigid bike. You can see that there's no suspension at all, front or back. And this is actually a rim brake. So you can see this little piece right here. These are the friction pads, and when you pull the trigger, it just puts pressure on it, making the bike come to a stop. This is a hardtail. It's just got the front suspension. You can see that right there. And this is the disc brake. Since the rim brakes are up here, and it takes longer for that bike to stop than the disc brake, since the brake is much smaller. And then this is actually the same bike, but it's a full suspension. It's got the front and the back suspension. And what that's beneficial for is when you go off jumps and whatnot, all of the shock is absorbed into your bike instead of into your body, so the impact is a little bit easier. So, body type of mountain bikers. Body mass doesn't appear to affect performance. However, BMI, upper arm circumference, and body fat are associated with race times. Mountain bikers are similar to climbers and to all-terrain road cyclists. And when I'm talking about climbers, I mean on-road uphill specialists. So this chart shows we've got the VO2 max, peak power output, relative peak power output, and body mass for mountain bikers, climbers, all-terrain, and flat specialists. And you can see there's very little difference between mountain bikers, climbers, and all-terrain. But when it comes to the flat specialists, there's a significant difference. Cross country is a very vigorous intensity sport using both anaerobic and aerobic metabolism. Demands are attributed to opposition of gravity and isometric contractions. Downhill is actually a moderately intense activity. This has a lot to do with the lack of pedaling, and it's mostly dependent on maneuvering the bike as gravity takes you down the hill. Athletes increase power level to above maximal power when climbing. So during a climb, you have more power output than during any other time of the race. Just like with running, when you're running up a hill, it's harder than running down a hill or running on a flat surface. And according to Epilizeri, power output during a mountain bike race can reach up to about 500 watts. So things that affect intensity. Your suspension. As you hit jumps or roll over large obstacles, the more suspension, the more shock your bike can absorb. It's easier for maneuvering your bike when you are on a rigid bike and you hit off a jump, then you have to control it a lot more than if your bike is absorbing some of that shock. Suspension decreases the stress on your body. However, you do lose power when you have more suspension because it's getting absorbed into the bike instead of into your body, so you can't push that back out into the race. Small muscle contractions. Upper body strength is used to control the bike. Like I said, maneuvering through things and over things, you have a lot of upper body isometric contractions. So the more upper body movement, the more difficult the ride will be. Your experience plays a big role in intensity as well. The better you are at anticipating a move, the easier the ride's going to be. Repeated climbs and ascents. The more climbs, the more difficult. Your experience has a little bit to do with this as well. If you know the trail and you know that a big climb is coming and you're doing a descent right now, you can take that momentum and have it help you up the hill. But if you don't know the trail and you aren't really experienced with maneuvering, you're going to have to slow down a little bit and lose some of that momentum. Equipment. So mountain bikes are pretty heavy, they're pretty bulky. And if you have a carbon frame, it's the lightest, but you're also going to spend a lot more money on a carbon frame than on an aluminum. So with the carbon frame, it's less weight to carry up on a climb. So having a lighter bike is going to make the climb easier. And a lot of racers actually take the reflectors and just little things that your bike doesn't absolutely need off to make their bike that much lighter. And then higher rolling resistance. With the tires, they're thicker and they have more tread than a road bike. A road bike is also known as a frictionless tire. So with the more tread and the thicker tire, it's harder because there's more friction between the tire and the ground versus an on-road bike. So this video, this was filmed in the Scotland Highlands where they're holding the World Championship. Claudio Clori is riding down the UCI mountain bike trail. It's a downhill track with a very small portion of cross country.
Here we go.
You can see when he first starts off the ride that he's really not pedaling until he gets down that first descent. And this is a man-made trail as well, so you'll see very unnatural looking rock gardens and whatnot.
Some fans up here too, and I quite like the fact that it's a bit moist up here, so all this gravel is not that slippery. It's quite tacky and pretty good fun here. Especially in these turns here, it's usually very slippery and you couldn't go that fast, but wow, I still managed to slide out there. I'm actually on a brand new prototype bike that my mechanic, or the team mechanic, just built up an hour ago, and it was a bit in a hurry because we were a bit earlier than usual with this GoPro run, and I hope he had all the bolts.
You can see right here he kind of starts to slow down a little bit.
Rock garden here.
That takes away some of his momentum.
Wow. This is good fun. Yeah, some of you said I should sing on my way down. Don't know if I'm gonna find a song down there, but wow, this is good fun here.
This is where a lot of the isometric contraction comes in, maneuvering through those rock gardens.
It's actually so flowy, but that's because they worked so much on the course after the British round. And ooh, kind of slippery there. It's getting a bit rougher here, but I think the suspension takes it all. Okay, let's see. Guess I gotta wait for my follow cam. I guess my prototype was just too fast for him. Or he must be tired from digging
And you
1
can
month.
see as he comes down the hill, he's really not pedaling at all, which is why downhill mountain biking is less of an aerobic sport than anaerobic. And he does mention later on in the video that his arms were tired, so he wanted that little break.
Cross-country mode here.
This is the cross-country mode, like you just said.
Momentum, because we're gonna go uphill here. And even here, they put down some dirt for us to cover up the roots so we can carry more speed into this last jump section.
So around 80% of the race is spent at or above lactate threshold. Blood lactate decreases in the final lap, but it's still found in a very significantly high level in the athlete after the race. It begins to accumulate at around 77% of maximal capacity for aerobic metabolism in cyclists, and in an untrained individual, that starts happening about 50 to 55%. This just further suggests that mountain biking is a very high-intensity sport. And you can see right here, this is the point of lactate threshold, so most of the race is spent up here somewhere. So there's a large correlation between cross-country and aerobic parameters. Isometric contractions are used to control and maneuver the bike, and isometric contractions are caused from the shock from jumping and rolling over things. Mountain bikers use a lot of upper body strength for controlling the bike and lower body strength and core to keep the bike stable and balanced. Power output required in climbs and at the start of the race suggests aerobic metabolism is necessary. The reason that the beginning of the race is considered an anaerobic part of the race is because bikers try to get to the front of the pack early on. It's much easier to pass somebody when you're in a big group at the front at the start of the race than it is to try to pass them on a single track. So they're in a very high gear, which minimizes pedal cadence and increases the amount of work So this graph is actually a study done by Burr and his colleagues. They measured grip strength before and after the race, and they found that grip strength actually decreased after the race, suggesting that there's a lot of upper body isometric contractions going on. Typically, mountain bike races are performed about 84% VO2 max. Mountain bikers, just like any other athlete, have a higher VO2 than non-athletes. Values for mountain bikers around 66 to 78. For an untrained individual, they're about 30 to 40, and elite runners around 70, so they're right up there with runners. For downhill, VO2 max values are a little lower, they're 63. And that's just because of the lack of pedaling frequency. And this picture is actually a study done by Burr. She's wearing a portable spirometer, and that's actually where these values came from, was that study. So we all know that isometric contractions alter heart rate. It's something that we tell patients in cardiac rehab. You're not supposed to hold on, you can't death grip the weights as you're lifting because that increases your heart rate. It's higher during a mountain bike race than compared with a stationary cycle, so that suggests that there's a lot of isometric contractions going on. Downhill racers maintain a higher heart rate during the descent, which is also because of isometric contractions for control and balance. Competitive bikers generally have bradycardia, which is associated with a high level of training, just like any other athlete. And they typically work at a heart rate of about 90% max during a race. Mean heart rate is actually reduced when using a front suspension compared with a rigid bike. Since the front suspension absorbs a lot of that shock, there's a lot less upper body muscle that needs to be used to control the bike, so that reduces heart rate. When it comes to the comparison between off-road and on-road cyclists, essentially there really is not that big of a difference, but off-road cyclists tend to be lighter and leaner than on-road cyclists. According to Lee, mountain bikers have a higher power-to-weight ratio, meaning they're stronger per body weight. Road cyclists produce more power at lactate threshold. Maximal power output is higher in mountain bikers when expressed in relative terms, but not in absolute terms. Peak minute ventilation, heart rate, minute pH, there was no difference between on-road and off-road cyclers. According to the Olympic Training Center, VO2 max is not significantly different, which further suggests that the two sports are very similar. We all know proper nutrition is shown to increase the amount of work that can be done, as well as the duration of work. So elevation of blood glucose is associated with supplemental nutrition is suggested to improve aerobic function. This is done through reducing muscle glycogen use or through the use of blood glucose as a predominant fuel source as glycogen becomes depleted. A high carbohydrate diet can be beneficial for athletes partaking in endurance events. Maltodextrin, which is a carbohydrate supplement with a high glycemic index, has been shown to increase the amount of work an athlete is able to do and the duration of the work. Maltodextrin increases blood glucose levels at rest, increasing power output and ventilatory threshold, and it induces a minor cardiovascular demand for the first 30 minutes, which allows the athlete to finish the race faster. Maltodextrin does not increase max power output or other physiological values such as heart rate. And a high carbohydrate meal can actually generate 3% more power than a low carbohydrate meal. When it comes to injuries, most of them are caused from crashes and falls. However, there's a few common injuries for bikers. Since athletes in a very uncomfortable and unnatural position for a long amount of time, and they're doing a repetitive movement, overuse injury is very common. Microtraumas occurring from jumps, rocks, and roots create tissue stress, leading to overuse injuries. And the common sites, which you can kind of see in this guy right here, cervical and lumbar spine, it's very stressed right there. Knees, obviously, and arms and wrists, or hands and wrists, I'm sorry. So there's another injury, is the patellofemoral pain syndrome, which is caused by abnormal stress within the patellofemoral joint. This is caused by poor biomechanics. I know I've been a culprit of this, and I've seen many people at the gym with poor biomechanics. as you're coming up to a climb and you're almost at the top of that hill, it's much easier to just start using poor technique to climb the rest of that hill instead of getting off, especially if there's somebody behind you, if there's a cliff on the side of you. It's much easier to just keep riding, even if it does lead to injury. And same thing with like a bicep curl. You've seen the guy in the gym that's trying to get, his 10th rep in, and he was at failure at 9, and he does something weird with his body to get his bicep curl up, leads to injury. It's been hypothesized that single speed versus multi-geared, single speed would have more injuries. However, they did not find that. They found that there's no difference between injuries that occur between the two different bikes. What they did find is that those who ride both are more likely to experience injury. That's because you're not conditioned enough to one bike versus the other. When it comes to training, first step is to familiarize yourself with the bike and functions and what it's capable of. This is when different types of bikes come into play. I've seen it multiple times. Somebody goes from a rim brake to a disc brake and they flip over their handlebars. They're not used to the bike stopping as fast as it does. So they hit the brake, the bike stops immediately, and their body keeps moving. So once you're familiar with the functions of the bike and what it can actually do, you start working on your technique through trails. Once you have a handle on how to maneuver through trails, you can start working on speed. If you can't make it through a trail without falling slow, then you're not going to be able to increase your speed at all. So step 3 is to work on speed, and then step 4 is lactate training. So after you're familiar with how to maneuver a bike through a trail, find a trail that's difficult but not impossible to complete, and you can pick from one of the 3: steady state, up and down, and lactate threshold tolerance interval. You want to train 2 to 3 non-consecutive times a week with a light ride in between. So something that's really important is lactate threshold for bikers. Not many of us have access to a lab that you can test your lactate threshold. So one common test that bikers like to do is they pick a 3-mile route that they can ride without stopping, strap on a heart rate monitor, warm up, and then ride the route as fast as possible, sustained at the same heart rate, and that's going to be your lactate threshold heart rate that you're going to use for the rest of the training. So you ride for about 20 minutes, recover for about 20, do it again a few times, and you take the average heart rate, and that's the value that you're going to use. So steady state interval. You ride at a pace that keeps your heart rate about 5 beats below the lactate threshold heart rate for 10 minutes, then recover for 10. And you work up to 20, and then you finally work up to 30. And you should see some progress after doing that. So up and down intervals, it's a blend of lactate and VO2 training. You work at your lactate threshold pace for about 5 minutes, and then you increase your work above about 5 beats above lactate threshold and work at that level for 2 minutes. Then you drop back down to your lactate threshold pace for about 5 minutes, and you repeat that until you hit about 20 minutes. And then the lactate threshold tolerance is training at an intensity where your body cannot buffer lactic acid completely. So you work at 5 beats above lactate threshold for about 2 to 3 minutes. Then you decrease for about 1 to 1.5 minutes until you feel partially recovered but not completely ready to go. And you go back up to about 5 beats above lactate threshold for a couple minutes, and you repeat it 3 times. And this increases your lactate threshold, which can increase your ability to ride fast. So adaptations to aerobic exercise: increased VO2, lower resting heart rate, increased number of mitochondria, increased myoglobin, increased stroke volume, increased capillary density, and increased ability to buffer lactate, which is very important in biking. So anaerobic adaptations: increased muscular strength and endurance, increased muscle fiber size, decreased mitochondrial density, increased bone mineral density, increased peak power output, and enhanced motor performance. So in conclusion, body mass isn't as important as training and technique for mountain biking. Cross country is a vigorous intensity activity. Anaerobic power plays a big role in mountain biking, as does lactate threshold. During a race, you're at about 80% above lactate threshold. 80% of the race is spent above lactate threshold. During a race, athletes work at 84% of VO2 max. Heart rate is higher when trail riding than when riding a stationary bike, and that has a lot to do with the isometric contractions. And most injuries are caused by trauma, but it's very common for overuse injuries for mountain bikers. So for practical applications, those who are training for mountain bike racing, both aerobic and anaerobic power are very important. Along with that, improving your lactate threshold. The best way to train is to ride. Technical ability is one of the most important things that you can have when you're trying to ride. And if you want to transition from road bike to off-road biking, there's really not much conditioning you need to do. It's experience with maneuvering and controlling your bike that is most important. So I hope that you guys all want to go out and ride your bike now, even though it's kind of cold outside. But just keep in mind that you want to increase your lactate threshold and maneuver your bike very quickly and easily through off-road trails. Here are my references where I got all of this useful information for. So again, I hope you guys want to go out and ride.